The tutorial in this video is going to be these little bags. This is the candies. So we have a drawstring bag, and there is a flap version of the bag. See? Can be used for candies, anything else you want to store. Don't we all have these? It has a loop placement on the top. So this drawstring version is the one we're going to make today. The only difference between the two of them is the casing for the drawstring and the flap. So instead of installing the casing, you install the flap on the last hoop instead. So, oh, and something else I've been using these for actually is I've been using them for poo bag holders. You can install a grommet. This is a 3/4 inch grommet on there, and you can use them for poo bags. There's one, and this is the other one. All right, let's get started doing this. So what we will be needing for this project will be square fabrics cut out, and we need, depends on if you're going to do the flap version or if you are going to do the drawstring version. As well, there are two stipple versions. So if you're going to be doing the flap version, you need to make that piece first, and I've already made it because I am going to show the drawstring version today. So this is the flap, and I have done a top stitching around it. So if you're going to do the flap, that's what you need. But I am going to be doing the drawstring version. So what we have is two pieces for the drawstring casing. Then you have two main materials, two lining pieces of material, and two batting pieces of material. And there will be two hoopings for the drawstring version. And I am also using a tearaway stabilizer, but it's kind of like a cutaway as well. It doesn't tear easy unless you actually cut into it. So that is what I am going to be using, and we're going to get started by doing the placement stitch. All right, the first thing that has to be done is the placement stitch. So I'm going to get that started. The next thing that needs to be done is we need to add the batting to this. I use a fusible fleece with the fusible side up so that I can iron the material to it when I'm ironing it. And you will notice on this placement stitch that there are two top lines. The line here is the line that you can line the batting up to. That would be the cut line anyway, so I just did that to make it easier. So line that up to that so you won't have to cut the top portion. The next thing that we have to do is we need to cut out the batting. The batting tack down has been run, and now we need to cut out around the batting, and it needs to be cut close. Now that the batting has been cut around, you need to add the main piece that the stipple stitch is going to be on, and this is the outside of the bag. It depends on if you're doing the drawstring version or the tab version, or the drawstring version. If you're doing the tab version, this is the front of the bag. If you are doing the drawstring version, it doesn't really matter which side it is. The fabric I have here is a quilting cotton, and I do have a iron-on interfacing SF101 Pellon. I use that for a lot of things. Then it needs to be going face down with the wrong side and face up with the right side, covering all of those. And the reason I like my batting with the fusible fleece is this gives me a good opportunity to iron it on and hold it in place. The next stitch I am going to be doing is going to be a hatch style stipple stitching on this version. Back at the machine, and I am going to do that hatch stitch. It ends up on both sides, not just the one, which is why there is two hoopings of it. All right, the hatch stitch was done. Let me just show it here. I think we can see it. So the hatch or stipple stitch, whichever one you want, there's a standard stipple stitch, or I like this hatch version. The stitch I just ran was the hatch version. As well, it goes around and it outlines. It's a little bit hard to see here, but it outlines the bag. I'll just flip it over and have a look at that. A lot easier to see where the hatch was done and then the outline of the bag ran. So that ran all in one step. And then what I also did was I needed to run the placement stitch for the drawstring casing, or if you're doing the tab version, that's not on this one. So this is specifically for the drawstring that I needed to run the placement stitch for that. I did that, and then now we need to get the drawstring pieces. The drawstring pieces, oh my god, material here. All right, the drawstring pieces are 2 pieces of material, and it needs to be turned into a casing. What I have done to make it easy, I use a fusible web to iron this down and then fold it in half to make the casing. The sizes for the piece are in the PDF instructions. What I do is I take a ruler, and you need to make this a 1/2 inch fold that goes in. So this little fold piece needs to be a 1/2 inch. So what I do is I take a ruler, draw 1 inch in, then fold it to the 1 inch and iron that little piece into place. And then I do use my little piece of fusing here. This one's a little long. Take that, I put that inside and fuse it down. That's going to help it from unraveling. This is one option. The other option is you can fold it here and then run a stitch down to hold it in place if you would prefer. That is also an option. Let me put this in. There we go. And then you just fold it in half and iron that. And you need to do the same thing so that you have two pieces. One for this hoop and one will be for the other hoop. So that's one piece. I'm just going to iron this one again. And that will be for the other hoop. So this is the type that has the fusible on it. Or, as I mentioned, you can also do a fold, and then you could stitch a top stitch on the outside to keep it shut, and again fold that in half. That is also an option if that would suit you better. All right, so the next thing that we have to do is need to add it to this. I'll take one of these, and then you take the fold portion of it, and the fold goes inside the bag, and the edges of it line up with the stitching here, and you go, let me just show you the stitching at the top here. It's hard to see. So you have the stitching that was done around, I'll hold it up. It's the outline stitching around here. That is where you put the casing up to. This is the placement line, but you go up to here, and then another stitch is going to run across the placement line, holding it in place for a tack down. I'll just put that on there, and I'm going to get a little piece of tape and tape that in place. You do not want your fingers next to that at all. So you can see the fold portion is here, the open portion is here, and now I'm going to take it back to the machine, and I'm going to run a stitch that goes across there to hold it in place. Okay, so I went and did the tack down stitch. It's just a simple stitch that goes across the top. You can see it here. I did it in white, make it easy to spot. There you go. Good way to dig up tape. Doesn't need the tape anymore. And then you can see the casing here has now been made. The next thing we have to do is add the piece that's going to be the inside lining. So I've used this for the inside lining. It's the same size piece as the outside. And what you need to do is, for this last step for the hoop number 1, you take the lining piece and you place it right side down, and you make sure that the casing piece is still laying on the inside, and you put this over it, tape it in the corners if you need to, or tape it down. And then the last stitch that goes across the top to hold these two pieces together will get run. This is the last step for this. Gonna get ready, and you really should use the same color thread as the main fabric, or whatever fabric you're using. You should always use the same thread for the seams. Alright, hoop number 1 is done for the drawstring bag. The next thing we have to do is take it out and give it a cut out of the hoop. Take it out of the hoop and cut it. For this pattern, we don't need to cut out the lining portion of it, except for I cut it on an angle. That way it will match up with the next hoop easily. What we need to do is take it out of this, and it is an odd cutaway, so I have to tear away, so I gotta cut that little bit first. When you're looking at it, this up here is the top of the bag, and this down here is the bottom of the bag. The notched corners are this is the side, this is the bottom, and then the notched corners are what are going to make the boxy look of it. What I do is I cut out along I cut out along the edge here of the bag. So I keep the stitching intact, not up here. I cut out along here, along the bottom, and the notches. And then you keep the stitching intact. It just helps keep it all together. When cutting out that portion of the bag, at the top, you want to make sure when you're cutting on the diagonal that you don't cut out on this side. You'll need to fold it back and then cut along. All right, that's what it looks like. And then we do not need to cut out the notch portion for this. All you need to do is cut out along the edge so that the edges match up. It makes it easier to line up on the other hoop, and leave the length. It makes it easier to line up. But you can take off a little bit of the bulk inside here if you wish. I'll take off a little bit of that seam. Leaving about 1/4 of an inch. Watch you don't cut the casing because you want that held in place nice. And there we go. And I will iron this particular piece down so that the lining goes into a nice way and it helps hold the stitches in place. I put this one up. When you're attaching the drawstring to the other hoop, it's helpful if the drawstring portion on this one is pushed up to the top. The easiest way to do that is by ironing it there. And ironing it down on this side. It just helps hold it. And when you put it together, it'll be a lot easier to get a nice edge. This is what piece number 1 looks like. And now we need to do piece number 2, or hoop number 2, and it is done in the exact same way as hoop number 1. We are doing the placement stitch, the batting, the hatch stitch. We need to also add a loop placement to the other stitch. It goes in the center, and the casing. All right, here we go. Moving on to hoop number 2. I will go cut the batting and be right back. The batting has been cut. I have ironed on the main material, and now to run the stipple stitching. All right, the stitching was done, same as the other one. You can see it all there. Got the outline, the hatch, the batting, and now we ran a stitch for the tack down, or the placement, sorry, of the loop. And you can see there's a center stitch here, indicating the center of the actual bag. That is useful, not necessarily for this one, but if you're going to be doing the portion with the tab, then it's easiest to find the top flap center, and that way you can draw this up. Don't have to measure anything. You can draw that up, and then when you're attaching the flap, it is easiest, you've got the center, and then you can just line it up to the center. That way you know it's the center of the bag. For this version, you don't need to find the center necessarily because the casing fits in nicely between the lines, between the placement lines. So for the top loop portion, I use a fold over elastic a lot of the time, just because of the thickness of it. It's not very thick and it sews nicely over. You can put some sort of a key ring, or this is a D-ring. I prefer a key ring, but not this size. I just don't have any of the smaller ones currently. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fold it in half and have the fold portion, see the fold portion on the one side, the fold portion goes inside, and you take it and you line it up however much you want sticking out when the bag is finished. And I don't like a lot sticking out. Some people like a lot. I don't like a lot sticking out, so I'm going to put it right about there. And you can see the center, so it's really quite easy to get this piece centered really nicely. And I have done about an inch. This is about a 5/8 of an inch piece, but I have done an inch so that if you want to put something thicker, you have that option. This will get taped down. Just gonna get some tape. And then a tack down stitch will run over that. And then after that, a placement stitch will run for the casing portion. Just gonna get that in there. And you do have to be careful what kind of tape that you use with this fold over elastic. I have used other tape and it's torn out the elastic ribbing portion. All right, back to the machine we go. Now for the tack down. And you don't want it to catch on that, so be careful. It's only one small tack down, hold it in place, because of the placement stitch. It's going to hold it down as well. And this is the same stitch as before for the placement for the casing. And the casing is the same thing. You have the fold on the one side, open on the other, fold goes in, and line it up to that. Now it is the same kind of thing as the first one, where we put the piece that is going to be the lining. It gets placed on top of this, facing right sides together. Okay, that's done. And I am going to take it out of the hoop just to fold it back and give it a good press. I think for the last step I just did when I took it out of the machine, I think I said take it out of the hoop. Don't do that. Do not take it out of the hoop. You take the hoop out of the machine because we still have stuff to do in the machine. So for this, I like to just cut off, again, just a little bit to keep a seam allowance of around 1/4. But again, don't cut this. You want this piece to be held in nice. So this piece gets folded back, leaving the loop piece. So you can see it's a loop. Leave that inside and leave the casing. You can see the casing piece. You leave that inside and you fold this up. And you don't have to take it out of the machine to do this. I just do because I like to give it a little press to keep it in place. And the next stitch is going to stitch basically the same line of the bag, and it's going to stitch it up here. We'll go get that done. And now we take the piece we did in hoop number 1 and we are going to be putting them together. All right, we have piece number 2, or hoop number 2, almost done. And we just did that stitch along here, and that shows you where the lining of the bag goes. And that's why you don't need to do it on this one. You don't need to cut it out. When you put them together, you just need the one template basically to allow you to cut it out. So it was easier just to do it this way. And now what we're going to do is we're going to put the two of them together. So it's going to be right sides together with the outside right side facing the other outside portion of the bag, and it'll be the lining facing the lining portion. What you need to do is you need to make sure that you have cut out nicely along the edges, and that way when you match it up, you will be able to match it up along the edge of the bag that you have done on this one. I will just do a little bit of a highlight here. Let me just see. Have a look at that. And that will be lining up with this piece. You line up the corners and you line up the sides. And the other important part about that is when you're taking it, you need to line up where the seams meet. And the seams meet there. And that's another reason why for the drawstring version, you can see they're on opposite sides, the casings. It makes it a lot easier to stitch. And then we get that nicely lined up and it gets taped into place. Tape on that side and come back to the other side and make sure the top is all nicely lined up on that one. Let me just show you here on this one if I can. See how the linings match up? The lining matches up with the lining and the seams are good to go. Get my tape here. And I like to add a big piece of tape along this one just to hold it in place nice. Try not to get your tape in the stitching area. So it's going to stitch along the side and it's going to stitch along the bottom, but it is not going to stitch in the little square portions. Those will be stitched by hand on a machine. It's unfortunate, but it's not that easy to do in the machine unless you want to do another hoop, and that doesn't make sense. So the easiest thing I find here is to keep this down with just a regular piece of tape. The regular piece of tape easily pulls off after it's stitched. So you don't want it getting caught as the foot's going back and forth. As for the lining portion, that is why we cut it on an angle. And all you need to do is make sure that you have the angle lined up with the placement stitch underneath. You see that? And do that on both sides. That doesn't have to be quite as accurate because it's going to stitch along the top. It's going to stitch along the sides and the bottom. And then when we cut out, we're just going to use the underside where it has the full template. And then tape it all into place, and now we go back and we stitch the final stitch. All right, final stitch is ready to go. And it's done. Now we take it out. Well, I shouldn't say it's done. It's done in the hoop. We now have to do the box corners and the lining hole at the back. And now we're going to take it out of the hoop and cut it out. We only have a couple of steps left. We have to do the box corners and close the lining turning hole. So you can see what it did was, let me just move it here, it stitched around here, and then here's the box corners here, and this is the turning hole. So the first thing is to get the cutaway off. That is done, and now we have to cut out around. You have to cut out around where the outside edge will be. You want to make sure that you don't cut the inside edge. You want to cut what's holding it together. That would be very bad. And when you're on the lining side, you want to cut out the notch portion here on both sides, and that's why you can use this piece as kind of like a template piece. Got to take out the tearaway on the inside of the lining. And I do like to cut this just a little bit. I find it helps with bulk when turning and the seams. But make sure that you do not cut any stitching. Same with the one on the back. I just cut a little bit there. And I just cut a little bit there. That way things will lay better when you're ironing them down. Just going to iron that just a little bit while I have it down here. This one's already down. And now we need to box the corners. It doesn't matter if you start with the lining or with the other side, but what you do for box corners is you need to take this piece here, you take this piece where the two edges are, and then you take this piece here and you put those two pieces together. To help out a little bit, you can just iron out the sides, just helps it. I just like things to be pressed. I find it easier. All right, so for this side over here, what you do is for those two corners, like I mentioned, you can stick something in there if you want, and you grab them and then you push them together like this. That way your side seam and your bottom seam match up together. And you just look at this side and kind of squish it. You can use a little tool, which is what I do a lot with this thing, just to make sure that they are lined up nicely. maybe the bottom seam, side seam, bottom seam, and I put a pin in them. And then you do this particular thing for all 4 corners of the bag. Now that we have all 4 corners of the bag boxed, you take it to a sewing machine and stitch across the box. So you'll put it on the sewing machine kind of like this, and then you kind of squish it a little bit, make sure nothing's underneath. And for the side that has the stipple stitching, the main, you can see, let me get closer here, you can see where the lining, not the lining, the batting line is. So you can see the outside, and then you can see where the batting line starts. So that you don't even need to measure. You just stitch right across, back and forth there. On the other side, same thing. You stitch across the line that you see right there. And for the lining side of it, you can measure in a 1/2 inch is the best way. So what you do is you take your ruler and you find your little 1/2 inch mark and you put it across. You can do 1/2 inch, you can do 1/4 inch. I think on this one I might do about a 1/4 inch. And just draw yourself a little line, or you can go to the machine and you can guesstimate where your 1/2 inch to a 1/4 inch is. And then you stitch across that. And you do that on both sides of the lining, and you make sure to leave the turning hole open. So I will go do those stitches and I will be right back. Okay, I'm back, and I stitched up those little boxed corners so you can see them on all sides here. And all you do is stitch straight across. It's just 4 stitches. You just go right across, and these are probably the easiest ones because you don't have to measure anything. On this side, you just stitch straight across and straight across. The next thing we have to do is we have to take the turning hole and we have to turn the bag. I find it easiest to poke through the main portion first. Get the corners out. There we go. And then it kind of just pulls out. And at this point, you need to get in the bag and you need to poke out the sides. And I did not use red thread inside, and you can tell, which is why you should use the same color. But I didn't feel like changing it. I'll poke out the little boxed corners there. You see how nice that is? Little boxed corner. And you can see the casing. And I'm just going to poke these ones out too. And now is the time that you will close the lining hole. However it is you want to do that. You can stitch it, you can glue it, you can, I don't know, fusible web it probably. I usually stitch it. I'm not going to stitch it right now, but I close it by hand. So the bag is like that, and then you just tuck the lining into the bag, push all the corners in, There you go. You see the inside. You see the little casing. And if you had a flap, right, you'd have the flap there now. And now to add the elastic or whatever else it is you want to use as a casing, as a, I don't know, a drawstring or whatever it is. So you just put it in the hole and get in it. And we'll start with one side of the bag. You slide it through. Coming out the other side. There it is. And it comes out that side there. And then to make the double style, you would put it back in on this side over here. You would put it so it came out this side, and then you put it back in and you push it through all the way to the outside. I just have to turn it here. Push with this hand. It goes through easy enough because it's a fairly large casing for a tiny elastic. So when it comes out the other side, then you're going to be doing the exact same thing with the second one. You start on the side where the loop is though, and then you put it in here, and then you go around, and then it will come back out on this side. All right, there we go. So we have them coming out both sides, and you will just tie the ends of them, and that way you will have a double drawstring. You can always do it the other way. You can always just put one in. Let's see. All right, here is basically the finished version for today's video. And what I have been using these for is you can, I think it would be great as a little gift. You can stuff it full of little candies. Huh? That'd be great, right? I do hope you give it a try. It's not that difficult, especially the little box corners. And I appreciate all of you guys, and thank you for watching.